the next seam finish is a French seam. French seams are the best seam finish for a very sheer or a very lightweight fabric that you want to reduce the fray on or stop it from being able to fray. One of the unique things about this particular seam finish is you actually start with the wrong sides together, and so you will put the wrong sides of your fabric facing each other, and you sew your seam allowance at 3/8 of an inch. So you can see that that is much narrower than a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So you would backstitch at the top, stitch to the bottom, and backstitch, and stitching at 3/8 of an inch with the wrong sides of the fabric together. Then you open it up, okay, press that seam open, and this fabric tends to finger press really, really well, or you could press it open with a press cloth because this is the right side of your fabric. Press that seam open, press it flat, press it open so that the seam is very well defined, okay? And then we're actually going to trim this seam allowance, and we trim the seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. I like to press it open before I trim it so that as I come back and hold those two together, and you are trimming both seam allowances the same, as I trim those, when it's only that 1/8 of an inch wide and you go back to press it open, I don't have to get my fingers so close to the iron in order to try to hold that seam allowance open as I press it. And so I do, a lot of times it will say trim and grade or trim and then press. I like to press first and then trim and then press again. Because that was already pressed, it tends to stay open just a little bit, and I can get back in there very easily and get that seam to open back up again. Okay? And so now my seam allowances are only 1/8 of an inch wide. The next step is to now fold this right sides together. That we started wrong sides together, I now fold it right sides together, and you fold it right along that stitching line. And that's why it was important that you press it, because by pressing that flat and pressing it open, that is what defines that edge and makes this step a little bit easier, because that seam is actually defined and it tends to want to fold along that edge, and so it will tend to fold there fairly easily. And so you've now folded it right sides together with that stitched edge along the side, and now you are going to sew it again. Now the normal seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch. We've sewed at 3/8, so if we sew the second time at 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 plus 1/4 is 5/8, and we will have taken a regular 5/8 of an inch seam. So we're going to go sew this at 1/4 of an inch. All right, remember the 1/4 of an inch mark on your stitch plate is this little teeny tiny notch or niche line that sits there in front of your feed dogs. So you will line your fabric up there at that 1/4 of an inch. Drop your needle down. Take a couple of stitches, back stitch. Again, I hold that thread a little bit, and then I am just going to sew this at that 1/4 of an inch. This creates a totally enclosed seam allowance, which makes it very effective in reducing fray because there are no raw edges to be seen. All right, so when you look at it, there is no raw edge to be seen. That's that folded edge. You have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And then you would open up that seam. Again, you'll press this flat as it was sewn, and then you'll press it. And on your sample, it's just going to go one direction. On your clothing, normally this would get pressed to the back. And again, this fabric has a little bit of metal in it, and so it finger presses really, really well. If your fabric doesn't finger press really well, get your press cloth out, use your steam iron, and give that a press. And you press that seam allowance to one side. And if it were on clothing again, it would press towards the back. And so you have a little 1/4 of an inch seam allowance inside there. If you look at it from the right side, you just see this completely clean 1/4 inch seam through it. You can't see that 1/8 of an inch edge that was turned on the inside. Even on a very, very sheer fabric, it hides it really well, and so it gives you a really, really nice, very clean edge that is attractive to look at and very effective in stopping fabric from fraying. And that is a French seam.